Vayeshev. One of the most interesting and fascinating stories in the Bible, and especially within Vayeshev, a place of a lot of fascinating stories, is Joseph and Mrs. Potiphar. And the Torah is very interesting, as always. Mrs. Potiphar tries to seduce Joseph. Joseph refuses. And when you think that it's a stranger in a strange land, he had no one really to answer to. Certainly he was lonely. And it could have meant a very good position also, I'm sure, within the court of Potiphar. He refused. Now he didn't refuse so easily, because the cantillation in the word Vayima'ain is a very long note. Vayima'ain. And the obvious interpretation is that it took him some time to say no. But he did say no. And Rashi explains very well that he said no because he saw Dmut Diokno Shel Aviv. He saw an actual portrait of his father in his mind's eye. And he couldn't sin before his father's face. A very revered colleague of mine, Rav Chaim Sabato, gave a very interesting interpretation that I think also can be expanded upon. He told me that he was once in a kibbutz, lo dati, not religious kibbutz, and he was talking about the biblical figures, and he was talking about Joseph, and he told this story of Joseph and Potiphar, and precisely the interpretation that he saw the face of his father before him, and he couldn't sin. And the kibbutznik stood up and said, "Rabbi, that's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. I've been in a similar position fairly often before. I never saw a picture of my father. The last thing I would have thought about was my father." So Rav Sabato said he had to think very quickly. And he answered him saying as follows. He said, "You know what probably happened? The mirror is a fairly modern invention. At least the fact that so many people have mirrors in their homes. In the ancient world, it was a rarity, and mirrors were very expensive. And Joseph, certainly coming from the poor home of Jacob, not necessarily poor, but it was a different life in Israel, and it wasn't a sophisticated life. So they certainly didn't have mirrors. And then, when he got to Egypt, he was a slave, and then he was in trouble a little bit. So he had never seen a mirror in his life. He was invited into Mrs. Potiphar's boudoir. She certainly had a mirror. And when he looked in the mirror, he saw a man with a beard he had never seen himself. But he had seen his father. And he, looking in the mirror, looked just like his father had looked the last time he saw him. And that was the image of his father that he saw. And I believe this is a marvelous metaphor for all of Judaism. When we look into a mirror, we do recognize ourselves. But we must also recognize our fathers. And even perhaps recognize our children. Because we are our parents and our parents are us, and we are our children and our children are us. We are, in effect, part of a golden chain of historic Jewish being. Our genes are our parents' genes, and our children's genes are our genes. We're the nation of the unfinished symphony, with a job to complete. We have a tremendous responsibility to the past, and we have an awesome responsibility to the future. And whenever you look in a mirror, you see yourself, and you see your children. And you understand that you have an historic responsibility to continue the Jewish narrative from generation to generation. Shabbat Shalom.